So there's a quote that runs, "Without data, you're just another person with an opinion." And I so think in a crisis, as many of us know, there are lots of people who have an opinion. So I think data used in the right way during a crisis can inform better responses and better outcomes. I think as well as giving you more insight to make the right decisions, it can also give you a sort of edge and help you make the case for what you're advocating for. So as a communicator, you will hopefully have a seat at the top table and be inputting and helping advise leadership on how to manage a crisis. And I think having data and being able to use data can really help you make your case more succinctly and give you more sort of power to your elbow when you're advocating. I think it's worth saying a little bit as well about just the term data. So as a communicator, I think, I've always used data to an extent. I kind of sometimes think I've not really, I've not used data at all, and I have, and we all use data. When you're managing a crisis, you're picking up bits of intelligence, you're picking up information, you're looking at what's happening in the media. There are lots of different sources you're using. I think where data intimidates some people is this idea of big data, which is a term which we've all seen coming in. We're all told it's really important. But I think that can, seem quite intimidating, because big data is really in its true sense is just masses of information, huge amounts of information, sort of millions of bits of information, whether that's, in a kind of database in the spreadsheet, whether that's actually out on the internet. The internet is a huge repository of data, as we know. So this concept of big data, though, is just almost seems too big and overwhelming. And I think actually what we're really looking at, what I'm interested in, is isolating that data that's relevant. So that corner of the available data that is really relevant to the issues that you're trying to tackle and the situation you're dealing with. So there's a guy called Sam Knowles who I'd really recommend Sam's work. He's a data storyteller. He's been in the business a long time, and he's got a really good book called Storytelling with Data, which I'd really recommend people have a look at. And he talks about this idea of little big data, which I really like, because it's about, it's really about honing into the data that really matters for you, rather than sitting there with loads of data and trying to, get some value from it, which is really hard. So, as I say, I think if you can sort of become more comfortable with data, and hone in on what really matters, then as a communicator, as someone involved in helping manage a crisis and preparing for a crisis, you can potentially have those tools at your disposal to help you respond better, to help achieve a better outcome, but also to advocate yourself for courses of action. In the middle of a crisis, situation, the last thing you want to do is trying to, for the first time, use data and gather data, because it's going to be probably impossible to do it that way. So it comes back for me, I think, to in the planning and the preparation phase for thinking about, how you're going to respond to really think about the challenges that you're going to face and what you're going to need to know at that time. So what are those? The worst thing you can do, I think, is just gather lots of data, and just you might have you might potentially be able to gather a lot of data from social media, from the media itself, so that external monitoring. You have got the potential to have your own sort of data, internal data, so that might be inquiries coming in, or messages coming into the organization. It might be comments on your own social media posts and your outputs. It may be intelligence on the ground that your staff are picking up. There'll be within the organization, even if you work for a small organization, there'll likely be a lot of data points. But I think where you've got to start is in your scenario planning, and particularly in things like simulation exercises, to actually really think about what are the big questions you're going to need to answer to respond effectively, and then work out what those, how are you going to get that. How easy is that going to be? What are the challenges going to be for that? So, I've mentioned a few examples. It will be quite sort of case specific, but it's pretty much a given that the external environment will be something you'll want to monitor, and you will do that already to an extent. I think where the opportunity is, though, is that the tools exist now. More and more, that with this idea of big data, big data sets, the tools exist now to really crunch these big data sets quite quickly, and actually, rather than sort of almost be kind of taking a sort of surface approach to collecting the data in quite a manual way sometimes, and sometimes in quite a delayed way, it is really possible with some data literacy, some basic data skills to, very quickly, for example, download a data set which might be your media coverage, for example, and really hone in on the messaging. So really kind of use textual analysis, for example, to really kind of, like go, okay, how are we being talked about? Like what, we can, across sort of say 500 pieces of coverage, how are we really being, kind of talked about? Or, to look at a community Facebook page, for example, if that was where your relevant audience was, and look at, actually that kind of those organic conversations. What is the conversation? And kind of, basically to help you monitor the external environment. It goes beyond just, I think, numbers, analytics, that's all quite, it's all great, but how useful is that? And I think, as I mentioned, in internal sources as well. So, your own data, often have your own really useful data flowing into the organization. And again, it's, probably during those kind of preparation stages, looking at actually what data you likely to have coming in during a crisis that may really, sort of spike. And how can you, how is it possible to feed? Is it, how easy is it to get to that? How useful is that? Does that help you answer the questions that you need to, answer more effectively? I think just to sort of round off on that, AI, so there's a lot of talk about AI at the moment, artificial intelligence. And the thing about AI is that data is kind of what feeds AI, it's what fuels it. So there are a lot of tools coming about now, which I would see having a really important role in managing a crisis, because they're able to crunch data and work with data at a much sort of bigger scale. So, in terms of your monitoring, it's always been slightly delayed as traditional media monitoring, as an example, because the technology is, it's just not kind of fast enough in a way. So you're always sort of slightly behind. Some of the tools out there now, there's a solution called Signal AI, which I don't use personally. I have no sort of, interest in it, but I'm interested in it because it's AI driven. It's able to process something like 5 million sources, and rising all the time in real time, and it's able to do context. So it's able to know that if you're looking for something happening in Manchester, you're not talking about Manchester, the US, not talking about other areas of Manchester, or it's Cambridge, you're not talking about Cambridge in the US. Or if it's a generic word that could have, kind of, you end up getting a lot of noise in your search traditionally. It's able to do context really well because it's based on machine learning. So the tools that are available are much more powerful. And obviously the time to test those and see whether they work is in advance in your kind of in your planning. So, well, I would say, basic data confidence and data literacy would be a good place to start. So, just say becoming a bit more familiar and a bit more comfortable with data. And you know, in order to do that, then how would you do that? Well, I think one of the good places I started was data journalism. So one of my big things is that I think we've seen data journalism you know, really grow. I mean, it's quite a mature sort of practice now. And a lot of stories now out there are being driven, you know, by data, and it's, you know, it's become embedded in a lot of journalism courses. And I actually think like we're quite, you know, I would say as an industry, we're quite behind, because it's only now there's a bit of, you know, there's almost a bit of a kind of digital PR kind of strand coming up. But, you know, there's no real kind of data communications kind of strand really. It's something I'm interested in trying to grow. So I think if you look at data journalism, that is, you'll start to see how journalists kind of approach you know, using data to tell stories and to find new insights. And I think that's, for me, that was a bit of a kind of spark. I started listening to a lot of podcasts and listening to effectively like case studies, and then starting to think, how would you then apply that to, you know, kind of either your, you know, kind of understand, you know, kind of perhaps understanding what you do as a communicator and a communications team and as an organization, understanding your kind of your weak points and your risks. How could you use that in storytelling? You know, how can you effectively be a data journalist within your own organization? And it just really got me thinking about all these applications. So I think, like, you know, understanding the potential of it is probably a good place to start. And looking at some really great examples from data journalism. I think having a project, so having something like, you know, I always think that's the best way to start if you want to almost kind of become a bit more proficient, is, you know, sort of take a data set, for example, that's already exists. You know, as you get more advanced, you can look into how you can get data sets that aren't already there. You know, they're available on the internet, but they're not in a ready form, for example. But actually, you've probably got loads of data within your own organization. And actually, particularly if you're thinking about data that might be useful during a crisis situation, you know, if you've got a data team or you've got a planning team who use data, for example, or whoever, where that data might be held, you know, there's data sets that you might have to report on or you might hold. Get that data set and just start, you know, have something that you want to do with it. You know, say maybe have a hunch that, you know, this is the story that I think I might be able to tell from this data, or just, you know, just start playing around and see where you get to with it. Because I think having a project is always a good, you know, having something you want to achieve is always a good, you know, good place to start, rather than just, you know, you have to, you know, learning some data skills or becoming data literate. I think, you know, having a chat to if you've got data people in your organization, you've got analysts or data specialists, you know, building some links with them could be, you know, because I think actually once they start to understand where you're coming from in terms of data, and this, you know, can come into certainly in terms of planning for crisis situations, then, you know, they can help you get that data. And I think, you know, sort of having someone to kind of help you and mentor you is really important. One final sort of plug that I give as well is I'm looking to set up, or I have started some hacks, so some data hacks specifically for comms people. So these are kind of bit of a kind of safe space where people who are interested and perhaps started to look at how they might use data more. And I'm talking probably, you know, I'm going beyond just, you know, kind of looking at some Google Analytics or looking at some Twitter, you know, stats, for example. People might be thinking, okay, how can we use, you know, really use more like contextual data? How can we crunch, you know, sort of big sets of data sets of text? How can we gather data that, you know, is there, but we, you know, normally we'd have to get it quite manually, and then how can we help use that to tell a story? We've got a group of people together who are, you know, small group of people are kind of interested in this, and the idea is that we get a data set of some type, and then we all have a go at crunching it and trying to find different bits of insight from it. And it's a kind of space for us to learn and to share what we do and to help each other. So you know, if people are if that's something that you think might help, then we're really open to it's an open sort of invitation to people to get involved. So I think there's no substitute for kind of hands-on. So I'd really sort of recommend getting stuck in and starting to play with data. I think the thing I'd add, it's a bit of a bit blue sky this, but I think there could be a really interesting role in future for communicators who are data savvy, and we may see is data journalists. It'd be quite interesting when we see more data journalists starting to come over into comms. So I think that's going to happen. It probably already is happening, but there'll be more data journalists, and therefore, when they come into comms, we will get the benefit of that. Almost like this idea of a white, in basically, in terms of IT security, you get these people who are like called white hat hackers. So they're basically people who've got the skills to be able to hack into systems, but what they do is they come and basically stress test your system. I just got this idea about how we might adopt that sort of approach, particularly if we think, potentially, within the data and within the organization, there's probably data in there that's put in the public domain about your organization that if viewed in a certain, actually, if you could get it and filter it, there's probably all sorts of stories in there, and there might be some quite negative stories for you. There might be a sort of crisis waiting to happen. So in terms of reputation, it's really interesting, this idea that we may eventually have people within our own teams who are there sort of who have got the confidence to be able to go, okay, this is interesting. We've got, data about attendance. If you're a council, for example, attendance data, it's usually in the public domain, but it's not necessarily in a nice little spreadsheet, but it's there. If you took that and put that together with the data on expenses, how much each council claim for expenses, you've suddenly got putting two data sets together, and you might find, you might not, but you might find that the person who's got the worst attendance claims the most expenses. And just that kind of data curiosity and that data mindset within a team could be something really, could be an interesting idea that we may see become, kind of, if it's a skill within a team, you could run the sort of exercises where we're going to go on a bit of a fishing expedition, and we're going to actually almost like that white hat hacker, kind of almost like stress test what negative stories are lurking around in our own data that we don't know about. So that's a bit of a kind of, I suppose it's a bit of thinking I've been doing. It may or may not come to fruition, but I think potentially there's a role there as well for kind of almost proactive data journalism, data inquiry within, for communicators to help spot some of those reputational risks before they actually arise.